In 2020, the Formula One world witnessed Romain Grosjean's car go through the Armco barriers and burst into flames at the start of the Bahrain Grand Prix. Despite the spectacular scenes, the extensive and ongoing advancements in safety standards we have seen in Formula One meant he escaped the car unaided in under 30 seconds and with little more than burns to his hands. 20 years earlier, he'd have been out of action for 6 months. 40 years earlier, he'd have been dead. I'm Peter Brook, I'm joined by Nedzo's F1 Gridbox and Motorsport Madness, and you're listening to the DRS Train podcast.
This is the DRS Train.
So today, we're going to cover a general history of safety in Formula One, because this, as we know, is among one of the more dangerous sports and one where even today there is still a very real risk of serious injury and or death. And to help us with this, we have a brand new guest. We're joined by Jack, who a lot of you would know better as Motorsport Madness. Jack, welcome to the DRS Train podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Yes, if you haven't seen my channel before, it's called Motorsport Madness. You can go and check it out after this podcast. I've got a series called F1's Most Horrific Crashes, which runs for about 4 episodes over about 4 or 5 hours, and it details pretty much almost every crash that has been in Formula One where there's been a fatality. Peter has featured on it as well, so do go and check that out.
Yeah, those videos, I mean, I'm not only saying this because I appear in them, but they're extremely well made, and they were quite a departure from what you've done before, because before that, a lot of your content is kind of Assetto Corsa and sim racing stuff, and then you've done these videos which have all blown up and done like over 1 million views. So what was the genesis, I suppose, to suddenly make these videos?
I felt like I could make a documentary because I've grown up just watching documentaries. So when I started getting into Formula One, I kind of felt like I could talk about it, if you see what I mean. And then I watched a documentary. It was called Apocalypse, and it was about the First World War. And I thought, I could potentially do something on Formula One about its dark times, shall we say, in that sort of style. And that's kind of what brought F1's Most Horrific Crashes to the channel. Originally, it wasn't meant to be a 4-episode thing. It was meant to be just one whole video, but it ended up being a lot more than that. And at the moment, I've got plenty more documentaries on the way. I released a trailer the other day, and the next documentary is going to be spectacular. It doesn't really focus on a crash per se, but I've been putting in a lot of effort into the next one, and it's going to be really good. But yeah, it's just completely changed my channel. I was hoping the first episode would get about 5,000 views, but it got at the moment it's got 2 million. So, so yeah, I kind of got that a little bit wrong. But it's been good.
They've really tapped into something and people's interest, I think, because this is it's always in the back of people's minds about the danger present in the sport, and a lot of people, even fairly new fans, are aware of notable deaths such as Senna or Jim Clark, and the kind of dangers that the drivers had to go through. And with that, there's been a lot of advancements in standards to mitigate that. And that was all kind of put to the test not that long ago with Romain Grosjean in Bahrain in 2020. Because that crash, everyone remembers it. It was known, like on mainstream news, it was being shown. It was the first time in a very, very long time that we had seen a car just burst into flames like that. And the race was stopped, and we didn't know for quite some time, well, first of all, who it was, and then if they were okay. And then we eventually found out he'd survived, even though it meant he wasn't going to race in Formula One anymore. But quite a remarkable story, because everything came together, the mixture of, the fireproof overalls, the helmets, the halo, the carbon fiber crash structure, all of that to mean that he survived it. Because, as I said, if that had happened in the 1970s, and stuff like that did happen in the 1970s, he would not have survived. But yeah, it shows that these days those risks are still there, but not for the most part. It's about as safe as you can get, I would say.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is something I say to a lot of people, that the danger is still there. It's just very well hidden, and it's difficult for that danger to be exposed. And we saw with Grosjean, he was extremely lucky. As you mentioned, we've had very similar accidents like that in the past. And I think of Helmut Koenig, for example, at Watkins Glen in 1974, very much an identical accident, and it ended with the death of Koenig. But with Grosjean, it is a true testament to the evolution of safety in Formula One, with the halo and the entire monocoque design, the headrests, the hands devices. And again, I got asked this recently: what was the luckiest escape in Formula One? And I always say Grosjean. It is just astonishing how he managed to walk away from that, albeit with relatively minor injuries. But yeah, and it's something that Formula One has to really be careful with. They cannot afford to be complacent with safety or anything like that, because the moment that they become complacent, stuff normally goes wrong, as we've seen in the past with the San Marino Grand Prix. 1994 and the Japanese Grand Prix in 2014, it can still happen, and we've always got to be careful.
Nedzo?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah, safety is always a touchy subject, because you get some people who grew up in an era where it wasn't as prevalent, and they say it was better back in my day, and it was when there was a risk factor. And to be honest, the risk factor is a valid point, but then again, I'd much rather see 1,000 boring races than one where someone dies. Like, I am because of the influx of Drive to Survive fans, I'm in the minority of Formula One fans who actually seen a Formula One driver die in a race, because I was watching when Bianchi died, and I was like, what, 10? So it tore me apart. But it's horrible to see that sort of stuff. And for me to go through that again, obviously, I'm older now, I'm more mature, but I still think you'd never want to see someone, especially Bianchi was by some people favoured to be a future champion. I disagree with that, but regardless of how good a driver is, you don't want to see them perish.
Something that tends to happen, and I'm guilty of this myself, is that we get fans and drivers can sometimes accuse the FIA and authorities of taking safety too seriously, because particularly since Bianchi's accident, we've had the virtual safety car come in as a new element, but also whenever it rains now, it's so frequently there's just needless red flags or safety car starts that we don't need, and you get the whole let them race thing going on. But if you rewind to the very beginning of Formula One history, well, there was no consideration of safety at all. It was just a given that this is going to be very dangerous, because when it had begun in 1950, circuit design, no barriers beyond hay bales or earthen mounds, no protection from spectators and marshals who were just stood literally right next to the track. The drivers themselves didn't even need to wear any kind of helmets. Their overalls weren't fireproof. The cars were not monocoque, not carbon fiber, just no crumple zones, all of that. It was a completely different environment and just attitude to racing, and it was just sort of accepted that you might die, but people still did it, which is kind of hard to understand, I suppose, because these days people understand there's a risk, but they're not thinking, oh, I might die today. They're like, well, I might get hurt or whatever, but it's extremely unlikely. Whereas back then it's surprising that more people didn't die, if I'm honest.
Yeah, it's very strange to look back at, say, the 1950s. You look at photos, you look at videos, and it's just absolutely crazy. But back then, that was the norm. They didn't see it any other way, which makes me think, when we look at safety now, we think, can't get any better than this. But back then, it was very much a gladiatorial sport, as Sterling Moss would describe it. And he, and just the thoughts of making it sort of safe and really safe kind of disgusted people like Sterling Moss. But you got to remember, this came 5 years after the Second World War, where people had gotten used to death all around them. But again, hay bales and no barriers and people standing by the side of the track, that was just the norm, and it had been the norm in motorsport for a good 50 years before that point. So nobody really saw it any different.
Yeah. There is one core distinction. Obviously, Peter mentioned that there was no helmets to be mandatory, which obviously is crazy. Now, at the start of a championship, those were only made cork helmets, obviously the little flat ones that are completely open face. They were only mandated, I think, in 1952. We had a couple of years where you could genuinely turn up to an F1 race and just not wear any headgear. Obviously, you probably wear a set of goggles, otherwise you get battered in the face and eyes with flies and stuff like that. But yeah, it is mental. Obviously, you mentioned Sterling Moss. I'm pretty sure he called Jackie Stewart a wuss for wanting to improve the safety regulations towards the end of the 60s and the start of the 70s. Obviously, if there was a driver to do that now, they'd probably obviously there's not really much else you can do with modern Formula One, but they would be stricken down immediately for criticising any sort of safety improvements. Even though we have seen drivers, obviously, right at the start of the Halo, there were people like Hamilton and Vettel saying it was ugly and stuff. But I think we've all come to the conclusion that those opinions are outdated, and they've also agreed to that statement.
Yeah, it's interesting with Sterling and Jackie. Them two are very good friends, but they were almost constantly at odds with each other over safety, which is kind of we look at Sterling with admiration to this day, but he did have some controversial opinions. I mean, he argued that the race at Le Mans in 1955 that Mercedes shouldn't have pulled out, and he kind of argued that all these people are dead, but can't bring them back, so we should keep racing. So he did have some words which we look at now and think can't really say that, but that's in the past now, and obviously we've moved on from those times. But there were some significant moments where the product of its time really showed. I think in Formula One, 1953, Argentina, there was a huge accident which doesn't get talked about a lot today. I think it was Nino Farina who went off the track, swerved to avoid a spectator who had wandered on, because I think between 100 to 300,000 people showed up for this race. And it was the president of Argentina who just made it a free race for everyone to go to. And he swerved to avoid a spectator, went into the crowd. And I think from the top of my head, 10 people were killed. But the race carried on. No one really thought much about it. But other reports suggest that up to 30 people were killed, which would make it the deadliest Formula One accident. But again, the drivers that even then were a bit unsure whether to race or not, because they could see the crowd getting very close to the side of the track. But they knew they could not race because there would be a riot. And again, that strangely doesn't get spoken about a lot.
There's two things that I'm gonna talk about. Obviously, I think that Argentina had a problem with crowd control, and Mexico also had a crowd control problem.
Yes.
I know in 1970 there was like 310,000 people turning up to the Mexico City circuit, and it's like they were all lining. Something's bad's going to happen. And also, Giuseppe Farina, for a world champion and for a guy who raced him in he raced earlier than that, and I'll get into it. He was a very aggressive and very gung-ho driver. There are stories. Obviously, he was involved in that crash that killed 10 spectators or whatever it was. He was involved in 2 accidents during the 1930s that killed other drivers. There was Marcel Leu, I think it was at Deauville in 1937, and then with Laszlo Hartmann at some race it was either the year after or the year before. He was involved in 2 deadly accidents that were obviously his fault, and his reputation has survived. No one knows him as the driver killer. People know him as the first F1 world champion, and he somehow managed to survive it, even though he has this reputation and this aggressive style and this uncompromising style in an era where uncompromising driving, and like if you drove like Max Verstappen in the 1950s, I'm pretty sure we'd be looking at like bodies piled up at the side of circuits.
They it was just a completely different mentality. Even if you know someone has died, especially spectators, you still keep racing, and the drivers themselves accruing their own body counts across their career, but still kind of carrying on, because this is, you almost never, I think they attempted this with Senna, but you almost never get sort of criminal charges put against a driver if they're involved in an accident with someone else that died, because I guess you can't really, it's hard to find intent. They're obviously not doing it intentionally or something, but that's, at the end of the day, someone's still dead. But yeah, they didn't. Even with that, even understanding how dangerous it is, they still just drove however they wanted. And it's easy to say, well, in hindsight, we have all this modern tech that they didn't have, and they were products of their times, and they only knew what they had, and so they just assumed this is the way it is. But yeah, even with it being as dangerous as it was, it took a couple of years before we actually had our first death in Formula One. Because the first death, it wasn't even a racing driver. It was basically a mechanic and a test driver for ERA, English Racing Automobiles. There was a man called Cameron Earl who was testing one of their cars on a private test track, and it flipped over and he died because no seatbelts and also no roll hoop. So there was no possible protection for your head. Your head was the roll hoop, basically, if you flipped. And that was the really obvious. Initially, that was the really serious issue, because at the time, not having seatbelts was kind of a good idea because they had the mentality, which is you have with modern motorbikes, it's safer to be thrown from the car than trapped underneath it. In this case, he did get trapped underneath it because they didn't have roll hoops, and even if they did have roll hoops, that alone probably isn't going to help you with everything else going on. But yeah, it's because when and this is something you hear very commonly from people at that time. They'll say, "Oh, there were two drivers dying every year." And I'm like, okay, well, if you look at the raw numbers, that is a bit of an exaggeration, unless they mean like, well, because on the side, everyone was doing Le Mans and sports cars and all this other stuff as well. Is that when you count that, then yes, it was pretty much correct. But otherwise, no, there were years where no one died at all, which is really remarkable. But yeah, it took a few years before we had our first death.
Now, speaking about seatbelts, I mean, even now in the historic racing, you still see people flying from cars. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, we had the Goodwood members meeting, and a driver came out the chicane, went into the barriers, and got flung out of the car. And at first, it looked like something bad had happened because he laid there for a couple of seconds before he got up and brushed himself off. And I think when you look at that time, I mean, even now, we all would love to drive a car around a circuit, but then I guess it was just the thrill of driving these cars. I mean, it must have been something else to drive, the Alphas and the Ferraris around the old Spa circuit at up to 180 miles an hour. It must have just been an incredible sight to behold. That's why the people kept coming and the people kept driving. And I guess maybe, again, after the war, people wanted to kind of have that, I guess, the courageous thing to do, which during the war was become a pilot in the Air Force or something like that. Whilst after the war, what could you possibly do? You could become a racing driver and do something similar. And that's, a lot of people made it to Formula One in the end, but a lot of people didn't. And yeah, I guess it was just such a thrill, and you wouldn't have just seen it another way. And again, with helmets only becoming mandatory in 1952, I think seatbelts weren't mandatory until I think the late 1960s, I believe. Yeah, and again, it took until about, I would say, the mid 1960s where people started to question safety in the sport. Even after Le Mans 1955, things hadn't really taken place. We saw a lot of circuits no longer host races, such as the Bremgarten circuit, but it took until the mid-1960s until people started questioning this. But again, not until the late 60s when things actually happened.
One evidence of that is the timeline that driver helmets took in that time. I think Dan Gurney was the first driver to use a full face, like full-on helmet that you'd see today in a Formula One race in 1965 or 1966. The last driver to use an open face helmet was Leo Kinnunen in 1974. It was literally like 8 or 9 years, and you'd gone from the first ever institution of a full face helmet to literally less than a decade later, everyone's using a full face helmet, and it's now everyone wants to use one. It's not that they are forced to. I don't think. I think that Kinnunen was just a bit of a product of a time before.
And I think also they'd realised, well, we've seen drivers such as, Alan Stacey getting hit in the face by a bird, which killed him, and Helmut Marko got hit in the face. I mean, he had a visor on and got hit in the face by a stone and blinded him in one eye. That they were thinking, actually, maybe I don't want stuff flying at my face all the time. So even so, it took a long time to catch on. But yeah, just going back a little bit further, like the Le Mans disaster of '55, that was insane because again, almost 100 spectators died. It was just carnage, and the race still didn't stop. You just didn't. Races just didn't stop back then. Like I think the red flag existed, they just never used it because the first Formula One race technically to use the red flag was the 1950 Indianapolis 500, if that counts. But that was because of rain, and obviously, at Indy they have they don't really let you race in the rain. Even back then, they knew it was a bit much. It wasn't until 1971, the Canadian Grand Prix, that we had the first Grand Prix that was red flagged, and that was because of fog. And it getting dark and everything. It took a very long time for that to come in as well. It just seemed like there was nothing that would stop the race going on.
the reason why they didn't stop Le Mans was the argument the race organisers used, was that if they stopped it, it would then mean that all the fans were trying to go, all the fans that were still alive, would try and come out of the circuit at the same time that all the ambulances to try and save all the fans that were injured or dead from coming in. And it was, don't get me wrong, there were some things that is shocking, like on the British Parve recordings, you literally see people putting like white sheets over the bodies that have spilled over onto the track, and they've just left them there rather than trying to move them. And that, like, by modern standards, is very shocking scenes. But the logic is there of they couldn't stop the race. But I know nowadays they would, and they have even cancelled entire weekends. For example, in Formula 2 with Antoine Hubert's crash, they cancelled the entire weekend because of a driver fatality. But back in the day, it was seen as it was actually a distraction. And it detracted from the safety of the people that were still there. Even though it was insensitive, it was about preservation rather than about sentiment and kind of respect to the dead.
We saw a similar thing with Monza in 1961, where Wolfgang von Trips and Jim Clark collided on the run down to Parabolica, and the two cars went into up the bank towards the crowd, and von Trips' Ferrari did hit spectators, and I think 15 people were killed. And again, despite the horrific scenes, and this was a title deciding race as well, despite the horrific scenes, once again, the reason why they didn't stop the race was because they wanted to get ambulance crews in. They didn't want that whole thing to be blocked. And it was quite disturbing because on one side of the circuit, you would have seen all this horror take place. But the other side, where, the main grandstands are, there would have been none the wiser. And you would have seen Phil Hill win the title that day. And he's on the podium smiling, cheering, even though his friend is lying there dead with 15 other people. And it's just tragic. But they did change things for the following year. They did add barriers to the Monza circuit the following year, which was quite rare for that time, for 1962, to have full-on barriers, and they stopped using the banking in Formula 1 as well in 1962, even though they still use it for sports cars, but with chicanes. But yeah, Monza sticks in my mind. But again, you had Argentina in 1953, Le Mans in 1955, and Monza in 1961. I can't think of any other races which had such high death count in Formula 1,
or any others that had spectators die. There's been ones that track marshals have, but so Spain 75 had spectators.
Yeah. I'm trying to think, because before you clarified F1 race, I was thinking of stuff like the Mille and stuff like, because there are crashes in there. But you said F1, so
because we've had track marshals, Monza 2000, Australia 2001, Canada 2013 as well. Yeah. I think those might be the only ones actually where spectators died. But that brings me another thing is the circuits themselves, because you mentioned the banking, is that there hadn't been. I don't think there in Formula 1 there had never been any accidents actually on the banking at Monza, but I think they got rid of it because they're like, we can see that this is a really serious accident waiting to happen. There's I suppose the film Grand Prix, there's a fictional spoiler alert fatal accident on the banking in that one, but otherwise, I don't recall any in real life, but you can tell that looking at the banking is insane. I mean, I don't know what degree it is, but it's much steeper than an Indy. But also, this was also very, very, very bumpy. And this is a place where we'd had Avis, which again had two enormous pieces of banking with no retaining wall, and some drivers did fly off that and die. And then we were still using the full Nordschleife. Pescara as well, this fucking 15-mile long street circuit. They just didn't. Back then they just didn't care. And again, Monaco, the barriers were people and brick walls. That was your protection, and the ocean. Yeah.
I will just say, Pescara was actually the first ever racing circuit to have a chicane put in for safety. They had one put in 1935, which is insanely ahead of its game, but because one of the 5-mile straights was deemed to be too long, surprisingly, so they decided to put a literal full-on bus stop chicane in the middle of it, so it reduced the speeds for part of the circuit. They didn't keep things to that for the other straight or for the 100 billion corners where they go around Italian like side roads.
I think that chicane today is a literal bus stop as well, actually,
Probably.
or it's the car
It's
park of the train station. Yeah. But yeah, they had at the time that they didn't have the same restrictions because these days I don't know if it's compulsory, but I think it's advisory that you shouldn't have a circuit more than like 4 or 5 miles in length, even though Spa breaks that rule. And
I like
Las Vegas,
not 4 kilometers.
something like that. But again, Spa again, that's another one because the original Spa was much longer. It was about 12 or 30, maybe about 9 miles. It wasn't as long as the Nürburgring, but
kilometers long. Yeah.
yeah, which went off. And again, it was a full-on road circuit. They just used roads that already existed, and you're going down at full speed. And there's maybe a small barbed wire fence as protection because it's farmland. But the Master King, you're going between houses at full speed and telegraph poles, and that's where we got this really famous example in 1960 of Chris Bristow and Alan Stacey dying within minutes of one another.
Mm-hmm.
And is that the only example of 2 drivers dying in the same race? I think it is.
Yeah,
In
Formula
F1,
One it is. Yeah.
In F1, because we've had, Ratzenberger and Senna died on the same weekend, but not in the race. And that was that wasn't even like they came together. It was 2 completely separate accidents that did it. And that still didn't seem to sway people at the time.
No. It's weird because at the time you didn't have as many cameras as you do now at a Formula One event, especially at Spa where it's such a long track. So you look at all the race reports and the cameras are only at the start finish line; they're not elsewhere. So the only photos that exist of those 2 accidents are from trackside amateurs. But the Chris Bristow accident is particularly horrific because he was decapitated. And from the reports I've read, his body lay on the side of the track for the rest of the race. And Jim Clark also clarified that, and from then on, he had a very severe dislike for that circuit, even though it's one of his more successful circuits. And I think about 10 minutes later, I've forgotten from the top of my head, it was Alan Stacey, who I previously mentioned, went through, again, the same corner, Malmedy, and got hit in the face by a bird and flew off the track, went into a field and caught fire. But he had been thrown from his car and killed on impact whilst his car was on fire in a field. But again, there was no announcement to the public what happened. And Jack Brabham was the winner that day, and he pulled in and celebrated like any other. But Spa was full of just ruthless corners. It wasn't. Air Rouge was comparatively tame compared to what it is now. But you had Burnhamville, you had Malmedy, you had Stavlo, the Master King as well. All incredibly dangerous corners. If you've ever driven on sim, any kind of sim, it is absolutely terrifying, even in the simulator.
I think the original Eau Rouge, it was actually a very large hairpin called the Virage de l'Ancienne Douane. And then they got rid of that artifice, and it became the modern Eau Rouge, which at the time, with these days, you can take it flat out, even in a Formula 2 car, which drive like absolute ass. But back then, it was very, very dodgy in that. But yeah, you mentioned Jim Clark because he, the following year, as we said before, was involved in Von Trips' fatal crash, which I think is probably the first example of a fatal accident in Formula 1 that was actually caught on camera. Because the ones before, as we said, this is long before Bernie Eccleston took over and brought in the broadcasting rights that meant the races were all broadcast live, is that you had the British Pathé highlights, or that the country hosting it might broadcast it or something, because again, relatively few people had televisions at this time. Anyway, but I think that one, Von Trips, that's the earliest example I can think of a fatal accident in Formula 1 that was caught on camera. But again, going back to Spa, it was 1960. It was 66. This was the game changer when because that race was wet and there were lots of crashes. And Jackie Stewart, who was relatively new to Formula 1, he's got caught under his car, upside down, trapped under it while it's leaking petrol everywhere. And then he was retrieved from the car, basically unharmed. He went to the medical center, and it was just like a tent, and that was it. And he was like, "No, this is ridiculous. We need to fix this." And that was the impetus for him to actually start pushing for safety standards. And so it was from the late 60s that we got some actually proper advancements, and it started to become a lot safer.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting for those who do not know, the 1966 Belgian Grand Prix was actually filmed for the film Grand Prix, which Peter mentioned earlier. And you actually witness just the chaos that happened when that rain hit the circuit. You had Joe Bonnier went off at Bernonville and was left dangling on this cliff, effectively. And you had about, I don't know, 8 drivers who went out on that first lap alone. And yeah, Jackie Stewart went off at the Master King, and everything was caught on camera. And you could watch that film and watch everything happen. And it's not staged; it is actually what happened in the race.
The only reason that Jackie Stewart was actually pulled from his wrecked car was because Graham Hill and you mentioned Joe Bonnier, who had gone off, literally, well, they were available and they saw one of their, because they were a lot more comrade, or they were a lot more together, the drivers were, then they would actively help each other because they knew how dangerous it was for all of them. They pulled him out of the car, and it was only then when he was taken to the barn with loose fag ends and hay bales, and it was completely unsanitary. Like that you talk about modern sterile environments in hospitals. Like it was literally a barn in the middle of a farmer's field, I'm assuming, with loose cigarettes and all that sort of stuff. It's like, no, it's just like, and I'm pretty sure when Jackie he got treated there or treated in Belgium, and then he flew back to the UK and got treated there because he didn't trust that he'd actually been treated properly.
Yeah, because I think it took them 20 minutes to actually find Jackie. But even when they found him, they had to borrow a spectator's toolkit because they didn't have anything. And then as they're trying to remove Jackie from the car, they had to be careful because there's fuel everywhere. They don't want to create a spark. And then, yeah, eventually they got him out, and the ambulance got lost on the way to the hospital from the circuit. It was kind of like the scene out of the Grand Tour episode where they go on a road trip around Poland and those kind of countries. And you had that scene where Hammond crashes in the Formula Easter car, and it just takes ages for him to get rescued. It's kind of like that in a way, and it was just absolutely crazy. And as you mentioned, yeah, going into this thing where there's just trash and cigarette ends everywhere. The doctor's probably sat there having a fag and everything, and it's kind of. It sounds like fantasy when you say it out loud, but this was the reality of Formula One at those times, and that was the accident that Jackie said, I think we need to change things after that.
So at this point, we'd seen in 52, they're saying, well, now everyone needs to wear cork helmets. By this point, you started getting the FIA actually bringing in a wave of regulations around safety, because we had, seatbelts came in about 68, 69, the 5-point harness. Full face helmets weren't compulsory, but everyone started adopting them just for themselves. They also had rules about it was either the minimum size of the cockpit opening, and that you had to be able to escape the cockpit unaided within 10 seconds. Those rules started coming in. And around that point, or possibly in the 1970s, when they brought in fireproof overalls as well, because that started before this. Cars catching fire didn't actually happen that often, but as going into the 1970s, that started to become a bit of a recurring theme. And so we got, and this came in tandem with the fact that we'd had 1963 was when Lotus brought in the monocoque car as well, so that was already much stronger, even though it was still made of like aluminium and steel, a much sturdier design. And then aerodynamic wings in 1968 is like, okay, now the cars are getting faster as well, so we need to take that into consideration.
I think that 1963 was also the first year since Maramon's death in 54, the first ever proper death at a Grand Prix weekend that didn't have any deaths. 63 was the first year that didn't have it. But the cars were getting strong. The cars were getting stronger. The drivers and the helmets were getting stronger, but also barrier safety. 67 Monaco was the turning point for that, because you had Lorenzo Bandini crashing into hay bales. The hay bales catch fire. He burns alive. And from that point onwards, the FIA said, right, no more hay bales. This is ridiculous. And from then on, circuit safety had quite a rapid change. From 67 and then until 72. 72 was when they had the last race at Ciaron, which was the last proper circuit with no safety implications whatsoever. And then it kind of stayed like that for a while, and then became outdated.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's one where I mentioned before that because Helmut Marko got hit in the face and lost his eye, that
Because
they
all the
thought,
stones at the side of a circuit because there was an active volcano and that sort of stuff.
yeah,
Yeah, the Bandini one's interesting because the chicane, the harbour chicane at the time was just quite literally a gap in the wall, which you just held your breath, closed your eyes, and just hope for the best when you went through there. But you had incidents in the past at that chicane where you had, I think it was Ascari who went into the harbour, and there was a remarkable photo taken of him going in. You can see his hands up, and he's just going in. But luckily, he was unhurt. But can't remember who the other one
Hawkins.
was. That's it. Yep,
Paul
he
Hawkins.
also went in.
65. Yeah,
Yeah, and so you had two previous accidents of people being flung into the harbour, and the Bandini one is when you watch the footage, it is just incredible how they didn't stop the race because you didn't just have the car on fire, you had the entire piece of track on fire because those hay bales just acted as it just made the situation a lot worse. They couldn't quite get to Bandini when they pulled him out. The fire reignited again, and they just kind of left him for a minute to, extinguish himself and pulled him away eventually. And sadly, he died 3 days later. But there was a hidden mooring head where Bandini had hit, so it just flipped the car. He hit a telegraph pole and then rolled down the track and then ignited. But all the while you're watching the footage of the accident, cars are going past, having to dodge water hoses and all sorts of stuff being thrown onto the Ferrari. Not once was it stopped. But again, as previously mentioned, hay bales were banned in Formula One after that accident. And eventually the harbour chicane changed to what it is now.
Yeah, there were so many ridiculous accidents when it came to fire. There was one year at Harama, I think it was 1970, with I think it was Jackie Oliver and was it Brian Redman? I'm not sure.
It was X.
Oh, it was Ix. Oh, yeah. So they go into this hairpin and they both come together. Massive line of fire ignites the track, and the marshals are trying to extinguish a fire while the drivers are still going round. And that, like, in terms of not just like going around the circuit or the other parts of the circuit, while they're actually coming through the corner. And that for me is mental. Like, how do you spray water on a car that's going through a corner?
It's crazy. I mean, and in that footage of the one at Harama, the Ferrari eventually starts rolling down that corner because it's on the slide banking.
Yeah.
So not only are the other drivers having to avoid hoses and foam and all kinds of other things, they're having to eventually avoid a flaming Ferrari that's slowly going down towards the grassy area in the middle. It's just like, seriously now, just stop it for 10 minutes just to sort the problem out. It was very lucky because Ix was actually trapped in his car for a while whilst Oliver got out quite quickly, because I think the Ferrari had a different kind of seatbelt system. Yeah, so it was quite complicated to remove, as we saw with Niki Lauda in '76. So eventually he got it out, and he was on fire, and he did suffer burns, but relatively minor burns, and it was again quite remarkable that no one got injured in that one.
Yeah. Jackie X has a couple of really like disturbing stories. Like I think one year he said, because he used to do endurance racing as well, and he was very successful in endurance racing. I think one year at Spa, we've talked about Spa's deadly nature. There was one year he was doing an endurance race as well. I think it was X. I'm not sure if it was someone else, but he came in from a stint once, and one of his teammates had told him, "Oh, by the way, there's some remains at I think it was a Master Kink," and he assumed that it was like, oh, a cow has come onto the circuit and it's been hit, and a cow's been hit, or like an animal has just walked on it because it's in the middle of farmers' fields. And he goes to the corner and he sees that a marshal's been cut up by a car, and it's like that kind of stuff. It's just like, yeah.
Yeah, that was actually Jochen Mass, and his teammate was Hans Joachim Stuck, and that was in a touring car race. And as you described, he was warned when they did a driver change. They said, "Oh, be careful of body parts at the Master Kick," and Mass assumed, "Oh, it's just a car body," and he got there, and it turned out to be a marshal, who I did actually find out the name of, and that's in episode 3 of my series, and you can find out a little bit more on that. But there are some really horrific stories. Another one was Joe Schlesser, 1968. That one was just unbelievable. Oh, a car built from magnesium, and on a circuit which was just ruthless, the Rouen-Les Essarts circuit. You had the Six Brothers, or Six Frères, sequence, which was 6 corners in fast sequence, and the Honda was completely unstable. John Surtees had refused to drive it, and it had, I think it was air cooled rather than the conventional method. So magnesium, this whole experimental thing, and Honda really wanted to show it off, and they chose a relatively inexperienced driver to do the job, and he was 40 at the time. And he took the start of the race slowly, just so then he could kind of get used to it a bit more, and then sadly crashed on the 5th lap. And the scenes that that took place still kind of haunt me, really, because you could just see the entire section of track is on fire from his car. And because it's magnesium, the water that the firefighters are pouring on just acts as an aid. It's just making it so much worse. And other drivers are quite literally having to either go on the grass or drive through fire. And Jackie Ickx was actually the winner that day, his first ever Formula One win. And he reflected on it, saying it was just such a sad day, even though it was meant to be, a good day. And I don't know how long it took before Joe was pulled away, but by that point he was already long gone. And it's such a sad story because his wife Annie was there in the pit lane. So she didn't see it happen, but she had heard about it, and she had she thought about suicide that very same night. And Joe Schlesser was just a happy-go-lucky person. He loved racing. He worked with Guy Ligier, done successfully at Le Mans as well, and sports car racing. He again was a really nice guy. So for something as bad as that to happen to him, and you've probably seen the footage, it's just such a sad way to end.
Yeah, there are two things I've got about that one. There's obviously the obviously magnesium burns white hot and it's obviously like thousands of degrees. The actual circuit, because it's an actual proper road. Apparently after the race there were indents and like there was the parts of the track surface been molten away because of how hot the flames burned.
I wouldn't be surprised.
It's really. So I was gonna say something else and then I've completely forgotten what it was now. Oh, that's annoying.
Mm-hmm. But magnesium, that's the one I remember at school in science class. They would give you small strips of it and then you would burn it over a Bunsen burner and they just were like, don't look at it because it's like as bright as the sun or whatever. But something that always kind of puzzles me is that up until this point, we hadn't really seen drivers dying from fires. Like across in the 50s and stuff, they were dying because the car basically flipped over and crushed them, but the cars didn't burst into flames. And that did become a recurring theme. Late 60s, early 70s, there suddenly a lot of examples of that. And they brought in rules around the design of the fuel tanks to try and mitigate this, but it just suddenly became an issue, and it's hard to say why it hadn't been before. But then the other big example, and this was when they were like, maybe magnesium is not a good idea, was Piers Courage 2 years later, because he was using that De Tomaso chassis for Frank Williams' first iteration, Frank Williams racing cars. And the same thing happened at Zandvoort. It burst into flames and he died. And then they thought, okay, yeah, let's avoid magnesium. Let's find something else which is light and doesn't, melt when you so much as look at it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'll just say I remembered what my point was. I also said that Guy Ligier, when he made his F1 team, but then went on to have so much success, he named all his cars after Joe Schlesser. That's what the JS was in his car designs. It would be like the JS43, which Panis won with Monaco. That kind of stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of people didn't know that. A lot of comments in my second episode, a lot of people saying, I didn't know the JS meant Joe Schlesser, because I explained the story of Ligier's formation. But interestingly, again, going back to Le Mans in 55, the Mercedes there was also built from a magnesium alloy called Elktron, if I'm saying that correct. So again, you had a situation where it's not just a car on fire, but it's just not going out and it's at thousands of degrees. And it, again, made the situation a lot worse. So you had those 3 accidents involving magnesium. But, Peter, you wondered why so many of these cars were bursting into flames. But again, in 1967, you had the 3-litre engine regulations come in. So the cars, not only were the bigger tyres, a lot more grip, but also a lot faster and a lot more unstable as well. So much more harder to control, more engine power, more speed, and just with that comes a bit more fragility.
I'd also add that they are a lot like if you look at them, they look a lot more skinny. They look like they aren't put together properly at some points. Like the engine cover, they don't have engine covers. They don't have you can see all the parts moving. Like that's gonna happen when you've got Colin Chapman saying simplify and add lightness to everything. It's gonna be there's going to be things that just don't work when things go wrong.
Yeah. They're also tiny as well. Like if you've ever stood next to one, they only come up to your knees. They're just it's just ridiculous.
When we see the historic Monaco Grand Prix that happens each year, and they drive cars from the 60s, and it's like we complain about how modern Monaco sucks now, and it's like, yeah, but look at the cars that it was designed with in mind, because they're so much smaller and they've got so much more room to move about that they're just tiny. And they had also, when we had the first wings introduced in 1968, they were up on these very tall struts mounted to the suspension. Even though there weren't any accidents, I think the FIA could see, okay, something's going to happen here. Those are going to break off. So then they were like, no, you have to have them much lower down from mid-1969, which kind of birthed the sort of modern shape of a Formula One car. But when it came to fires and issues of cars bursting into flames, this then culminated in 1973. 72 even, with Roger Williamson again at Zandvoort, because that again the whole thing was captured on camera, and there's the scenes of David Purley getting out of his car to try and help him. The marshals are just sat around not really doing anything because they don't have fireproof overalls, so they can't go anywhere near it, and he's there like trying to flip the car over and can't, and has to just basically watch his friend die. And that again was another big kind of watershed moment for safety that we need to step it up.
Yeah, that was in 1973. And what makes that even worse is that was at a time when safety was really improving. It was doing very well. And Zandvoort had just been upgraded to meet the new safety standards that were being introduced. So it had barriers, it had a new race control room. And again, you have Roger Williamson in that car. The whole thing's on fire. David Purley's trying to rescue him, and those marshals are just standing there. I mean, yes, a lot of people say, it's disgraceful that they didn't help, but at the same time, they couldn't help because they didn't have the equipment to help. But the question remains, why weren't they equipped with, fire extinguishers, fire retardant clothing? And I think the fire rescue crews finally got to him 8 minutes after the crash had happened, and there was and by that point it was too late, and David Purley had to stand there and watch his friend die.
Yeah, there are some grim kind of readings around that. Apparently, Purley had later said that he heard Williamson screaming to let him out, and it's part of the reason. Obviously, 8 minutes to get to the thing. That's why I think that's part of the reason why they got rid of a Nordschleife in the end. Obviously, TV crews and stuff couldn't hold a proper race there because it was a nightmare to get all the cameras in the right places. But also for safety, it was deemed that if you have like only a couple of medical vehicles, you'd need to, if on like a track like a Nordschleife, you need about to have the same modern safety standards. You need about 20 times the amount of stuff. You need 20 times the amount of ambulances. What's good and stuff like a helicopter going from the one end of a circuit to the other end of a circuit could take ages. And 8 minutes just isn't enough of a response time. You need to be there within like 30 seconds, if not a minute. That it is just ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean the Nordschleife was the largest. Well, both in length, but also I think from the top end to the bottom end of the circuit was about 3.5 miles, so longer than most circuits, and that's in a straight line. Because by the early 1970s, the drivers had boycotted Spa, and so they'd stopped racing there and gone to Nivelles and Zolder, and Spa. It would come back in the future, but much shortened. They were still doing the Nürburgring. They got rid of the banking at Monza, Pescara, Avis. Those were gone. Zandvoort, I think they continued because at this point it was still using its much longer layout, and then soon after they got rid of that, or the circuit was just dropped completely, and then came back in the modern day, and now it's it's basically just a go-kart track. It's tiny, the modern version of it. The Nürburgring again. This came that last from the kind of old age of circuits. That was the last one to go, of course, in '76. Another car burst into flames. This time, Lauda does survive, barely. Admittedly, he had 4 or 5 drivers trying to help to get him out. But this one was compounded that we mentioned the very complex seatbelt arrangement got him trapped in the car. He was wearing fireproof overalls, but that didn't seem to help much. And he was at Bergwerk, which is at the very top of the circuit, so as far as you can be possibly from the paddock. They'd already decided to get rid of the Nordschleife at this point, but this kind of just reinforced it. And yeah, this one is remembered because he survived and then went on to win another 2 championships afterwards.
Yeah. Obviously, the main reason why he has a lot of the burns that he later became famous for was because his helmet was torn off in the accident, and that basically just because he was open to flames for a minute straight, and he just burned away his face. And the only reason he actually, we could argue the only reason he survived that was because Arturo Merzario, who was one of the drivers who responded to that scene, had tested for and raced for Ferrari, so he knew how that seatbelt mechanism worked. So he could be the one to get the seatbelt undone and pull him out of the car.
But if you, when it comes, I suppose, a little bit going back a bit, when it comes to seatbelts, this is the famous example of Jochen Rindt, the first posthumous champion, because Lotus had introduced the 5-point harness, but he didn't use the 4th. He only used 4 of those because he wanted to be able to get out easier in the case of a crash. And that ended up killing him because it meant that with not the one that goes in between your legs, he just slid, when he hit the barriers, he just slid down and it cut his throat. And so then they were like, I think we need to make them use all of these now. But it did mean that it did leave cases like that, and Roger Williamson and Joe Stiffer and other people around that time, that they ended up just trapped in the car because they couldn't get out nearly as easily.
Yeah, and there was also around that time you had an issue with barrier safety, and barriers were still very much in their infancy, but you had so many incidents where barriers were killing drivers. One of those being Francois Sever, Helmut Koenig. But interestingly, Clay Regazzoni crashed at Monaco in a Formula 3 race, went headfirst into a barrier, but miraculously survived. If you've ever seen the photos of it, his head is there, dead in line with the top rail of the barrier, but he still managed to duck in time to make it through unscathed. But you look at Jochen Rindt, when he hit that part of that barrier gave way, and that allowed for that damage to happen on that Lotus. And also Francois Sever, parts of the barrier got destroyed in the impact when he went to sort of get airborne at the top of the S's at Watkins Glen. And that inflicted some horrendous injuries onto Francois. Effectively split him in half, and there are some horrendous photos online which you can see if you know where to look. And Helmut Koenig as well, very similar to Grosjean, what we spoke about earlier on, hitting the barrier, and the bottom barrier gave way whilst the top barrier stayed in place, and you could imagine what happened. And we also briefly mentioned earlier the Spanish Grand Prix 1975. Throughout the entire weekend, you had 40 barriers all over the place, and the drivers wanted to boycott the race, but they knew the organisers wouldn't be happy with that, and they threatened to impound the cars in response. So they had to race, and unfortunately, it went very wrong very quickly.
Yeah. I mean, that was the last year of the Franco dictatorship in Spain, so I can understand that had they tried to do something, I assume that they would have had the hell rained down on them by the dictator. But there were some drivers who did end up boycotting. Obviously, Emerson Fittipaldi did a joke lap in practice and qualifying. It was like 20 seconds on the pace, then didn't start the race because he didn't want to risk his life. Larry Perkins, I think, also backed off, as did Wilson Fittipaldi, Emerson's brother. But there were a couple of drivers who did just refuse to race. But yeah, that race was a joke because, I mean, the driver who ended up winning it, Jochen Mass, no offense to him, but he's arguably the worst Grand Prix winner of all time. Just because of that race, like, he qualified 12th, goes on to win in a race where literally everyone falls out of contention because of either barriers or because of typical 70s reliability.
Mm-hmm. It does seem like death and devastation just follows Mass wherever he goes. He's kind of famous for that. But he had... Yeah, the 75, because Rolf Stommel had a crash and he killed. It was a fireman, a photographer, and 2 spectators, and then they did stop the race. So this is one of, again, a relatively early example of a red flag, and the first example of half points, which also meant Lella Lombardi. She had held on while everyone else had been crashing out, and so she scored half a point, first woman to do so. But yeah, with Sever and Koenig, because both of those crashes happened at Watkins Glen. Sever, this again was another game changer because Stewart had already made the decision. His teammates had to retire at the end of the season. He then retired. He then just didn't do that race because he'd seen his best friend and mentor die. And also, Jody Scheckter witnessed this, and he then took over Sever's seat. But before this, he was a very unpopular driver because he was very reckless and had been causing a lot of big accidents. And that was basically the wake up call for him to just like rein himself in a bit and be a bit more cautious. So that one again had a big effect going forward, but not so much on like car design. There weren't any big changes when it came to safety until the creation of the first carbon fiber chassis.
Another interesting one was the Josepha crash at Brands Hatch, because that accident introduced afterwards, obviously, introduced in-car fire extinguishers after that, and air to be fed to the drivers' helmets, which in incidents like Roger Williamson didn't help. But at least from in-car fire extinguishers, which are the norm now, was introduced after Joseph had crashed, because he sadly died due to smoke inhalation. But also the only injury he had was a broken leg. And the 3 fire extinguishers that were present at the Hawthorne bend didn't work properly, so they couldn't extinguish the fire in time. And unfortunately, that killed Josepha, even though he only had minor injuries. But again, from that accident, you had in-car fire extinguishers and piped air, which eventually would help people like Gerhard Berger, who crashed at Tamburello in 1989. He had, again, piped air fed into him whilst he was unconscious in a burning Ferrari. So, and from time to time, again, you see really extreme examples of fatalities which go on to change things for the good. And again, Josepha's accident did that as well.
Yeah, we've seen, because the in-car fire extinguishers, they'll carry this now. This has come up a few times in Formula 2. We've had drivers had to retire from races because the fire extinguisher has basically just gone off by itself in the cockpit, which kind of makes it look like the car got just a bit too excited about the race. But in another big one, and this is one we forgot to mention actually with the death of a marshal, was Tom Price at Kyalami in 1977. Again, this was caught on camera, and it's again fire extinguishers because Renzo Zorzi had pulled over, his car caught fire, and then there are no yellow flags. We had safety cars at this point because it was Canada, I think 73, I think 74, the first safety car.
73.
And that was a crash. That was one of the crashes triggered by Jody Scheckter, I think. It was that little Porsche 914 was the first ever. Yeah, that was the first ever. I think after that we didn't see a safety car again for donkey's years after that.
No, it's because the only reason it ever got put out was because Canada, obviously the Motorsport circuit, I'm pretty sure it was Motorsport and not Mont-Tremblant, but because they did IndyCar and NASCAR, I think they had those series already used pace cars, as they called them, and they put it on standby. They thought, you know what, this is a good situation to use it, let's just use it. Obviously, it ended up because they didn't know, because it got deployed wrong, and then the drivers got misaligned. It turned out to be one of the most complicated races of all time because people thought Howden Ganley was leading, but he wasn't. And it was Ronnie Peterson, and then all that. Basically, people to this day still don't know if Ronnie Peterson was the rightful winner of that race, or was it Peter Revson?
It's Peter Revson. Yeah.
Sorry.
But yeah, I mean, Motorsport itself was a bit of a dodgy track because that's the one where, in the 80s, Manfred Winkelhock was good in a crash there. Ian Ashley crashed into a TV tower. Yes. One of the races of the 1970s. Like, this circuit's a bit much. And again, as I mentioned, this is the first track that had a red flag because of fog and rain, and that was because that race in 71 had been delayed because forgotten the name now, but there was a driver in the Formula Ford support race crashed into an ambulance that was tending to another driver and died. So it's that all of that stuff happened. But yeah, the Tom Price one again. This was caught on camera that he crashed into he hit a marshal at full speed and then his head was taken off by this like 40-pound fire extinguisher, which got fired a few hundred feet into the air. And so his car is just, and then he's dead, and it just rolls down all the way down a very, very long straight, and he hits. Is it Jacques Lafitte? I think then hits as well.
He wasn't rolling down the straight; his foot was fully on the throttle still. He was dead at the wheel.
Yes, yeah. It was, yeah. So that again was another one, and then they changed. I mean, they didn't change it took several years because Kyalami got changed about 10 years later. They did a complete inversion of the layout. I don't think it was because of that accident though. But that was the last example of a marshal dying, I think, until 2000, possibly.
Possibly.
Sometimes it's hard to find out. There's a lot of records that don't really show that sort of stuff. But yeah, Tom Price, the marshals, for whatever reason, they, from what I've read, potentially panicked when seeing Zorzi's car suddenly go up in flames, even though it was only brief. And Zorzi, in the footage, you see him trying to get out of the car, but there's a cable still connected him, and he struggled to get out. So, from what I've read, potentially those two marshals panicked and went to go and help Zorzi. But also on that straight, you went over the brow of a hill. So, from that position where those marshals are, they could look to the left, but they can't really see the rest of the straight because there's a hill there. And the cars probably be traveling about 170, 180 miles an hour. So they wouldn't have seen Tom coming. I think it was Hans Stuck who was in front of Tom, and he moved out the way. He saw the marshals cross the track. He moved out the way, but by that point, it was too late for Tom to move out the way. For people who have seen the footage, it is quite horrific. Probably one of the most horrific things. I mean, I was criticised for not showing it on my series, but the reason was it's just such a, you don't see that happen often, and in that way as well. It really is just a horrible accident.
And it's something that the Formula One official season review has in HD as well. So yeah. But this, late 80s, late 70s, early 80s, big game changer for car design was ground effect and turbos. So we enter a new era of design and a new era of speed. And so the cornering speeds went up. The cars at this point were still monocoques, aluminium honeycomb. It wasn't really surviving the stresses of all this extra downforce they now had from ground effect. We had Patrick Depailler. He was killed in a testing crash in Hockenheim. I think he basically kind of ran upside down, kind of rode the barriers and that. But then Hockenheim again, that one was that actually survived all the way until 2001 as this old school, very fast forest design. And we'd seen Jim Clark had been killed there in a Formula 2 race in 1968. And they put in chicanes to slow it down, which did seem to help. But then, as I mentioned before, 1981, Lotus and McLaren in tandem both build cars made out of carbon fiber. Mm-hmm. But McLaren's is the one that is used in competition because Lotus, one of Colin Chapman's many innovations, he'd made a twin chassis, but they said that was illegal because it's a movable aerodynamic device. But McLaren's car does run, and then we see John Watson has this pretty big accident at Monza, and he walks away completely unharmed. And it's one where it wouldn't have been fatal, but you look at that and think he would have had a broken leg or something from it. And everyone was like, okay, I think now maybe this is the way to go, carbon fiber.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Yeah, that one, the chassis was actually on display at the F1 exhibition in London. You can see it's just, there's a few cuts and bruises in it, but it's still relatively intact. And before then, people looked at that and went, why are you using that? That's just heavy. You're not going to make a fast car out of that. But then after that, everyone went, maybe it does actually work to protect the driver, because you look at the flames that come out of the McLaren, the engine block came off. It was just a spectacular accident. But John Watson managed to walk away. And from then on, you had more and more teams taking on carbon fiber monocoque chassis and ditching aluminium. But after that, you did see a few more accidents which have resulted in injury and or death from aluminium chassis cars.
Quickly, before we move on to guys like DeAngelis, Senna, Ratzenberger, I just want to say that you mentioned the performance aspects. Obviously, carbon fiber is lighter than aluminium, even though it's stronger. But also, there were some weird anomalies with that, because Arrows, they designed a car, I can't remember which year it was, but I think it might have been like 1981, where they actually had the best chassis on the grid in terms of like aerodynamic performance. But because it was, or because of ground effect performance, but because the ground effect was warping the aluminium so much, it made it so that it was uncompetitive, and it made it so that it was no longer like a competitive car because the aerodynamics are being ruined.
That I think that was Ligier.
Is that Ligier?
They had there's one. It was the suspension was bending, and then it was the chassis. When they tried to strengthen that, it was just doing a bit too much. But so that was more of an impetus, I think, as well for carbon fiber. I'm kind of surprised that carbon fiber hadn't been used sooner than this. I'll be honest, because I think it was invented in like the 1860s, so it was a material that had been around for a very long time. But they just hadn't really thought of it, and it also with this kind of came the concept of like a survival cell as well, because we've seen now, and from a lot of accidents, even like again Grosjean is a great example. The actual even though the wings break off and they're designed to break off, the cockpit itself is basically impenetrable. But around this period, we did have a few other accidents in that. Well, Clay Reg at Sony, Long Beach, 1980, goes into a barrier at full speed, and he ends up paralysed from the waist down. So not fatal, but he ended his Formula One career. Ronnie Peterson as well, Monza 1978. He switched over because back then they were much looser about rules about entries and cars you were using. He crashed his Lotus 79. He switched to the older Type 78, and then there's that big crash at the start, caused because basically the starting lights went out before the back of the grid had lined up. Mm-hmm. And I've seen from the replays that the drivers at the front they're like just creeping up to their spots, and then the lights go, and they're like, "Are we going?" And they all go. But his is one of the more unusual ones because he crashed. He had severe injuries to his legs because this is back when your feet were in front of the suspension, the crumple zones. And then he broke his legs, but then he goes to hospital and ends up with a fat embolism and dies from kidney failure. And that's a very we've never seen anything remotely like that in terms of deaths in Formula One.
Yeah, you saw in footage Ronnie was quite happily talking to his rescuers, like James Hunt, for example. But it was Vittorio Brambilla that was considered to be in much worse condition, and the priority was to get him to safety into hospital, whilst Ronnie was sort of a second thought kind of thing. And yeah, it's such a shame that happened. But interestingly, Sid Watkins, who was very new to F1 at this time, was prevented from attending the scene by Italian police. And people have asked me that why, but reason is, at the time, a lot of circuits didn't like the idea of somebody coming in and telling them what to do. I think it was Hockenheim in 1980 or 1981, where he was refused entry into the race control room, Sid Watkins. And in response, Bernie Eccleston was like, right, okay, everyone out their cars, we're not racing then, and threatened to just get up and leave, which race control and the organisers didn't like, so they were forced to allow Sid Watkins into the race control room. So there was a lot of circuits who didn't particularly like Sid Watkins, and again, not allowing him to attend the scene for 20 minutes is quite ridiculous. That would never ever happen now. But that race did result in the introduction of the medical car and the safety car to follow the grid at the start of races, which still happens today.
I mean, it's from a medical perspective. I think what happened with Peterson, because this is why there's often when people have like severely broken bones, that there's a risk of infection. I think is that it's when fat got into the bone marrow and then it got into his bloodstream, and that was what finished him off, and they obviously hadn't noticed it in time, basically. But up until then, he'd been basically fine, other than having broken legs. I mean, it meant either way that the title went to Mario Andretti, because that's something that he shares with Phil Hill, the only two American champions. They basically won their titles, well, both at Monza and off the backs of the deaths of their main title rivals.
And teammates.
Yeah, and teammates. Yes, of course, Von Trips was Ferrari. So that's kind of a unique, or well, I wouldn't say fun, but interesting fact maybe about those two drivers. But yeah, so we'd had turbos, ground effect, so now the cars are much faster. But then everyone brings in from 82 onwards. Basically, everybody is using carbon fiber, so the cars are much safer. Still not safe enough though, because then we go into 1982. And we have Gilles Villeneuve. And again, another crash course on camera. Again, we mentioned Jochen Mass, that death and destruction seems to follow him everywhere, because some people still accuse him of blame him for causing that accident. That one, what seems to have been the issue is that the entire seat came out of the car and threw him from it, because his seatbelts were still on, but for some reason the actual seat itself just kind of gave way and came out of the car. And I don't really know why that happened, but that meant he got thrown into a fence and died from that.
It is a strange one. You don't often see obviously drivers being thrown out, but not with the seat. I think the only other one I could think of was Martin Donnelly in 1990. But apart from that, I can't think of any others. But Gilles Villeneuve, probably one of the best F1 drivers ever seen, especially from Canada. And again, with Mass, it's just so unfortunate. It seems like accidents just follow him, because I think 2 months later at Paul Ricard, he had an accident with Mauro Baldi going up the back straight of the Paul Ricard circuit, and actually went upside down and into the crowd in a very similar accident to Guan Yu Zhou, actually. If you watch the footage, he goes straight into the crowd. And from then on, he decided to quit Formula One. And on a side note, I do know Mass is currently quite ill and has withdrawn from public events. So I do hope that he does get better.
I think he's in his 80s now, so he's one of the older.
Yeah,
drivers.
he is. I met him last year, and he's still chatty and happy, and he had a good weekend at Goodwood last year, but do hope he gets better. But you also saw with the Ferrari from that year, you saw Pironi a few months after the death of Gilles Villeneuve at Hockenheim hit the back of Alain Prost and got catapulted into the air in a very similar way to Villeneuve, but kind of comparable to the Mercedes at Le Mans in 1999. Just flew up into the air and landed on his front end and destroyed the front, but he wasn't thrown out this time. He stayed in the car with horrendous injuries where he thought he was going to die, and he was panicking. He said to Sid Watkins not to cut his legs off, and Sid Watkins never considered that, but in that state he thought he was going to die, and eventually he managed to pull through. But again, 1982 was a pretty horrific year.
There are some other morbid details about Pironi's crash. First of all, I remember him saying in an interview afterwards that he said he could see the tops of the trees.
Yeah.
When he flew up, that's quite horrific. And also, the reason why he said to Sid Watkins, "I don't want to die," is because apparently before, like at the start of his career, he talked to like a psychic medium for some reason, and they predicted that he would have his legs cut off in an accident, and that's why he said, "I don't want my legs cut off."
See, if I was a Formula One driver, I wouldn't be going to.
Because he never, I mean, he never got he never got amputated. I don't think it's just that his legs took forever to heal. But then he died in a powerboat race, so he was kind of tempting fate anyway. The other one in 1982 was Riccardo Paletti, because this was involving Pironi. He rear-ended Pironi at the start of the Canadian race when Pironi stalled. And at first, it was just he was trapped because, again, crumple zone is your feet are the crumple zone. So he was trapped in the car, broken legs. And then you watch the footage, and Sid Watkins and Pironi, they're there to try and get him out of the car, and suddenly the car bursts into flames.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, where's the fuel come from? The rest of the car is fine. The front of that Ozella is crumpled in, but why is it burst? And so because it burst into flames, then he was dead when they managed to get the fire out.
I think that also was the race where they decided that they needed to make steering wheels detachable.
Yes, that was another one. Yeah, because it meant also it was the first season where two drivers had died in races or on race weekends. I think since 1960, because a lot of the deaths before that had been like in testing and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Did 1968 maybe?
68.
Schlesser and who else was there?
No, just Schlesser.
There were a couple of drivers who were killed, but in other racing categories.
Or in like non-championship races. There was a lot of that as well.
I will also just quickly mention where there was one accident that we forgot that was like 1 year earlier, and that was at the Belgian Grand Prix, the one with the arrows.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that was
just and whoever it was. I can't remember who the other one is now.
It was Riccardo Patrese and
Siegfried
Storr, the two Arrows drivers. Yeah.
Yeah, that was just nuts. I still see that now. It's still like it hurts to watch. It's painful. Yeah. And how on earth? Because I touched upon it on my first episode, and I didn't really know how to explain what was going on. I obviously explained what I could see, but it doesn't really take. I don't need to like tell people this is bad, because there was I think it was a mechanic who was killed in the pit lane the day prior. So the drivers and the mechanics, they all went on strike, but the organisers just sort of disregarded that and told them to get on with it. So all of a sudden you got all these cars just drivers running around going, "What do we do? We need to get onto the grid." And it took them like 5-10 minutes to sort the grid out. Not for the formation lap. The formation lap's already happened, but the cars are all over the place. So you have this situation where you got these cars just sat on the grid, getting hot. Carlos Reutemann was getting quite agitated about this, and was signalling to say, what's going on. But Patrese had stalled his car and was sat there waving his arms for about 5 minutes, indicating that he stalled his car. He needs assistance. And I think it was Alan Jones in the Williams behind him who, in the end, started waving his arms just to get some attention onto Patrese. And then, as we know, Dave Luckett, the mechanic, went onto the grid at the wrong time, just as they started the race. But apparently, race control didn't have their TV on, or it wasn't working, so they couldn't actually see what was going on. But surely somebody should have said something.
Or looked out the window.
Or just looked out the window, yeah. Something must have done. And we're talking about 1981. Things had advanced. You'd expect to see something like this happen in the 1960s, where we did have close calls where people were stood on the grid when the race started, but not in 1981. And Siegfried Stoll, was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and wouldn't have seen it coming, and unfortunately hit Dave Luckett. But luckily, he managed to survive the injuries, even though they look pretty horrendous, and who sadly passed away a couple of years ago now. But just you can watch it on F1 TV, the entire build up to the accident, and I barely know how to describe it. It's so chaotic.
Not only was that obviously some of the most poor race direction in Formula One history, but I also blame how narrow the circuits were at some points at the time. Like that was, I know it wasn't fatal and it's not a particular safety. It is kind of safety issue, but Austria 1987 takes 3 tries to start a race because it's so narrow. Like you think you wouldn't have the start of a race where everyone is together. You wouldn't have a track that's less than 3 car widths wide, because that's what that circuit was.
Yeah.
Yeah. It. I mean, with the Mazolda 81, the coverage from F1 TV, it's not brilliant at actually dissecting what's going on, because you don't see that. Yeah, they'd done the formation lap already, but then I think PK had stalled or was out of position, and he got sent around with someone else to do a second formation lap, but everyone else had to stay. And so you see him kind of weaving his car through, but then he takes a really weird line to get to the front row, and so he kind of parks his car diagonally, and then they got people to push it in. And by this point, Patrese has stalled, and I think somebody else has. But you don't, in the footage, you don't actually see Dave Luckett run out onto track, but then you see the wide shot of when Stoll hits him, and the response after that. But he'd been basically squished between 2 cars for Formula One cars, relatively low speed. But he had some broken legs, but otherwise he survived it. But I think that the marshal that had fallen from the pit wall, he was in hospital. He died the day after, but he'd already been in hospital because he'd been hit by Carlos Reutemann after falling from the pit lane. Yeah. But Zolder, because the year later we had the Villeneuve crash and they got rid of it, because the idea was, with that and Nivelles-Boulet, we need something a bit safer than Spa. Nivelles-Boulet, as well as being a crap circuit, was basically too safe, so they got rid of that one after only a couple of years. And then Zolder, they were like, well, it's all fine and well, but it's just a bit dull. It doesn't have the spirit of Spa or the challenge or anything. And then by this point, they'd been working on modifying Spa and brought it back soon after.
See, if that was nowadays, they'd do a street circuit in Brussels.
Yeah. I mean, the Madrid thing, like they've got Carlos to suck up to them and be like, "Oh no, I promise you, it's going to be amazing. We definitely need more street circuits." And
the promotional video they got for that. Did you see the driver on the promotional video showing you around the track, and he spins off in the middle of a lap?
Yeah, he can't. He just crashes. And it's like, they don't. It's not even a nice area. It's in some industrial estate or something. It's like
it's just an exhibition centre, isn't it?
It's like an even shitter Formula E circuit. Like it looks like the XL London one.
Yeah, I was about to say.
It does. Yeah, it looks like that. Maybe they'll do it once. They're like, no, this sucks. So Formula E can have it. They can have our scraps off the floor.
And
anyway,
4,000 chicanes.
Yes. Yeah. Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about. So we mentioned that. Yeah. But from 82 onwards, like. The carbon fiber, that really made a huge difference, because drivers every so often would get injured, but fatalities were still relatively became much rarer. I mean, the next one after this was Elio De Angelis in 1986. That was a testing crash, and again, that was because the car burst into flames. Basically, that Brabham he was driving. But we saw that was at Paul Ricard. The year before that, there's a crash. Senna went off at the end of the Mistral straight, and he goes through like 2 layers of fencing into the tyre barriers, and that's a massive shunt. But he was fine after that. But it was just this really pathetic, like a garden fence or whatever, was the protection before the tyre barriers.
I also one thing I will say about the De Angelis accident was that it was also due to poor regulations surrounding testing, because obviously now, like when you went to a race weekend, don't get me wrong, it wasn't perfect, but they had good response times, they had good marshals, they had the fireproof stuff, and they had all the stuff they needed to attend to drivers in some way. But for testing venues, the regulations weren't the same, because when De Angelis crashed, I'm pretty sure it took marshals half an hour to realise that something had happened and that he'd gone off, and he died in that time. So, that would never happen nowadays. Like it was the fact that it advanced in race weekends, absolutely, but in testing sessions, it was like you're back in the 1960s again.
It's ironic, really, because Paul Ricard is probably the safest circuit around today.
Yeah, nowadays. Back when it was still had all its grass and stuff, didn't it? So
yeah. So then we mentioned about Gerhard Berger, 1988. The car burst into flames, and we will get to Tamarello for something else a bit later. Martin Donnelly getting thrown from his car, Jerez, 1990. That was a big one because we saw the scenes of his twisted ankle, and that put an end to his Formula One career. Was it at Spa, Eric Comas? Yes. Or Eric Bernard, one of the random French guys that no one cares about, crashed and was stuck on the throttle. The throttle was stuck open, and that was when Senna went to rescue him from the cars. Yeah, so that was what I mean. Again, it's like, obviously that put Senna in a different light, because a lot of people saw him as a kind of villain. Even if these days, Prost is always portrayed as the heel and Senna as the face in their rivalry. Because I think he knew that, well, if we keep the throttle on, the car's just going to blow up and overheat or catch fire or whatever. But even so, there was a few minor injuries along the way. I mean, we went, and this came up on Twitter in a discussion recently. Was actually going back a few years. Martin Brundle, was that in a Formula One where he broke his ankle and then he couldn't do left foot braking? Yeah. Dallas 84, yes. And then this wasn't Formula One, but Johnny Herbert had the same issue in Formula 3 at Brands Hatch as well.
It was because you know how there's like bridges on circuits.
Yes.
The indents. He hit one of the indents in the bridge, and it broke his foot. I'm pretty sure. Or injuries.
So we're reaching the stage where drivers are getting injured rather than killed. And then we get to cripplingly injured in some cases, or something where they just have to put up with it, I guess, for the rest of their career.
Another one at Spa as well. He crashed at Eau Rouge.
993, yeah.
So we had a lot of close calls by this point. So at this point, people like Senna were starting to question the safety of the sport.
Yeah,
and then had about 1 billion concussions, didn't he? Because he just crashed all the time.
Yeah, I mean, he drove like a caveman, so it's not surprising that he crashed as much as he did. But yeah, then 1994, the season just it all came to a head at Imola, because we had the crash we had Barrichello breaking his nose in that crash because he just clipped the top of, he went airborne on these fucking enormous curbs and just clips the top of the tyre barrier, and that flips the car over. And then Ratzenberger, because now the cars were so fast, and they hadn't, other than carbon fibre, they hadn't changed much else. I think about late 80s, they'd actually introduced really, really robust safety cells around the cockpits, but it still wasn't enough, because now, well, him and Senna, it was head injuries in both cases, and that needed more work on cockpit protection.
With the 1994 cars, obviously they took away all the driver aids, which I think was the cause of most of it. You had 1990s speed, but 1960s like handling, where the cars were so twitchy and they could go off at any moment, essentially. Like, don't get me wrong, nowadays we've seen how Formula One cars are on rails, and everyone is saying we want cars to be less on rails and more twitchy, but we don't want them to be like obviously what the 1990s were. But yeah, they were both head injuries because for some reason, I don't know why, but they decided to put on the 2 fastest corners on the circuit, on the exit of the 2 fastest corners on the circuit, concrete barriers. Like, why?
It is astonishing. And also with those 90s cars, you were so exposed. Exposed. you were less exposed in a car from the 1960s. You look at the 1988 McLaren. You can see the driver's shoulders from from photos and everything. It's just crazy that these cars go nearly 200 miles an hour, and if you've ever sat in one, you can see the wheels. You can everything is all around you, and you're this close to the actual track. But and also you didn't have any headrests, still no hands devices. So when Ratzenberger hit that wall, it was I think one of the highest G-forces registered in Formula One history, and he was dead on impact. But I think he had clipped the front wing of the what was the car?
Simtech, or the wing had broken off and got stuck under the car.
Yeah, so when he went through Villeneuve curve, the car just basically didn't turn because the wing went under the car and just went straight on. In a similar way to Gerhard Berger at Tamburello in '89, and PK as well, and who was the other one? I think it was Alboreto.
Alboreto, yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of crashes happened there because of mechanical failure, and what we had on the 1st of May 1994 as well. It goes because Tamburello, I don't think, wasn't really a difficult corner. It was just extremely fast. And didn't really require much skill to get around, but you had so many incidents there, which again goes back to the point: why wasn't there a tyre barrier put there?
Because Villeneuve, it was called Villeneuve because it was their first race there in 1980 that Jody Scheckter and Gilles Villeneuve both crashed at that corner across the weekend. Fairly sizable accidents. They were unharmed. I mean, the cars were slower and different circumstances, but so then they named it after Villeneuve basically because of that crash. But I think with Ratzenberger, I don't think it actually was head injury. Basically, he had like an aortic dissection. Basically, that he'd hit the impact was so hard that it basically just ruptured the aorta in his chest, and that's partly because it was just concrete barriers. There was no padding or anything to dissipate the energy at all from hitting it. That's and even today, if you hit a Tech Pro barrier at that speed, that would be a huge shunt, and you probably would have some kind of injury, but it wouldn't be fatal.
You'd be stuck in 5 layers of that Tech Pro barriers to be hit at 200 miles an hour.
Yeah, that would dissipate a lot of the energy. You'd probably have to spend a night or two in hospital, but otherwise you'd manage. But so that meant that was the first death in 8 years and the first at a Grand Prix weekend in 12 years. But then everyone woke up because they'd said they wanted to reform the Grand Prix Drivers Association. And then we get the start of the race, Pedro Lamy and JJ Leto, and that again that injures spectators. The debris flying into the grandstands goes over the catch fencing, and then Senna's crash. And then this one woke up again because we had. It shouldn't make a difference, but I think it does make an impact when it's a driver of his stature that is killed, and we hadn't seen somebody of his stature really since Jim Clark, I think, that had died in a race as well. And so then that brought in the next major wave of safety advancements. Some very quick temporary ones, and then some more permanent ones from 1995.
Yeah, because I think it's Martin Brundle who said, "Well, if Senna could be killed, what chances have we got?" And the drivers of the 60s had the same attitude when Jim Clark was killed at Hockenheim. If Jim Clark could be killed, any of us can be killed. So let's do something about this. And Senna's death really had an impact, which we can probably still see today. And it was, again, shocking because Senna wasn't just a famous F1 driver. He was famous across the world. Everyone knew who Senna was. Even my own family, who are not F1 fans at all, they knew who Senna was. And again, it was just so shocking that that corner had a concrete wall instead of any kind of tyre barrier or anything really. And if they had, then we would have probably seen a different outcome. But I think, just a small piece of that suspension had penetrated his helmet and hit him in the wrong area. And from the reports I've seen, if it hit him a couple of inches higher or lower, he would have survived. And you do see briefly in the helicopter shots, you do see his head briefly move, which gave people hope that he's going to be all right. But then, after the race, you hear the news that he had passed away. But you also saw, I think it was Alboreto again. He had an incident in the pit lane where one of his tyres came off and hit a few mechanics in the pit lane. So it was just absolutely terrible, terrible weekend, which didn't stop there. You had more incidents in '94. You had the Martin Brundle and Jos Verstappen incident at Interlagos, where Brundle was hit in the head by Verstappen's rear right wheel, and you also had who was it at Monaco?
Paul Wendlinger.
That's it. You had him and a whole host of other things that happened
Pedro
throughout the
Lamy
year.
and testing at Silverstone.
Yes.
Yeah, Andrea Montemini broke both his legs and is outing replacing Ratzenberger in that Simtech, wasn't it?
Those cars, they should have never got rid of those driver rates. That's just an end of it.
Yeah.
Or phase them out slowly over a couple of years.
It meant at a whole bunch of circuits, such as Barcelona, Canada, Spa. They put in temporary chicanes in various places just to help slow the cars down.
The Nedzos at Monza, and I think got rid of the banking.
Yeah. They did a lot. So for 1995, I think that they reduced the engine size from, wasn't it down from 3.5 to 3 liters? There was still a lot of people were still using it was a mixture of V8s, V10, V12s on the cars. Ferrari were the only ones still running V12s. And then for 1996, they had raised cockpit sides, which fuck ugly, basically. They were really bad from an aesthetic perspective, really poorly designed because it made the cars look just lumpy and clunky.
That Ferrari. Oh god.
Yeah, the Ferrari one is especially offensive to the eyes. But they done this because I was doing a stream yesterday, and there's a side-on picture of Damon Hill's Brabham in '92, and yeah, his shoulders are above the side of the cockpit, and the head. I mean, the roll hoop is way above his head, but there's a little bit of padding, like a little cushion behind his helmet, and that's it. And it's like, yeah, it's remarkable there weren't more injuries really. And I think with Senna, didn't it go through his visor as well? Because I'd be amazed because the helmets are not that different from modern ones in terms of how they're built. So it would have taken a lot of force to go through the actual main body of the helmet.
I think it was the visor.
Yeah, and these days they're much stronger. I mean, that came in 2019. They introduced brand new helmets that had like a narrower visor to help with that and stuff as well. But yeah, from this point onwards, it was like I think a lot of people are thinking, I think we're more or less covered, because by this point, well, the next fatality wasn't for another 20 years, but you had drivers far less often you had serious injuries, and for the most part, yeah, they were much safer. The drivers were a lot more well protected. They had there was a lot more tyre barriers, Armco catch fencing, so the spectators were very well protected as well. There's not many examples really of big injuries other than Schumacher breaking his legs, Silverstone '99, and then there was Luciano Berti at Spa in 2001, and he was in hospital for 5 days. But other than that, it was mostly just the odd bump and bruise here and there.
Schumacher at Indianapolis, Kubica at Canada. That's about it.
Yeah. And there were pretty spectacular accidents as well, especially Kubica at Canada. But again, I mean, Alonso was taken to hospital, Brazil, 2003. And yeah, again, drivers getting a little bit hurt, cuts and bruises here and there. Yeah, it's just and that just goes to show that after Senna had died, they really, really worked hard on getting these cars safe. And already by that point, you had the HANS device. I think by 2004, I can't remember.
2003.
2003. And you had the headrests as well being introduced in the mid 1990s, which I think Jos Verstappen credited as saving his life at Spa again in 1996, where he had a pretty heavy shunt there. I think at Sablo, I can't remember. And yeah, you have all these things, especially as the fronts of the cars as well were a lot longer than what they were beforehand. And again, by this point, by the late the late 2000s, you have this situation where I guess organisers were getting a bit complacent because you had all these crashes and like Mark Webber at Valencia, and people think, well, if people can survive that, nothing bad can go wrong.
Yeah, I mean the Mark Webber one is interesting because that's a huge crash. I mean, I don't know if we'd ever seen a car go that high before in the air, and he bounces. He goes into the Tech Pro, just bounces off, and then he just you can tell he's just pissed off. He just throws his steering wheel out of the car. Like he's obviously not hurt, but but the car has done exactly what it needs to do because the front wing and both of the wheels broke off, but the safety cell was completely intact. I think with Bertie's crash in 2001, he had been trying, they credited the headrest. I think he'd been trying a different type of headrest that maybe had helped him with that one, even though it was a head-on collision, so it would have been the head going forwards. That meant he had a concussion, had to be in hospital for a few days. But yeah, you saw.
Go ahead.
You saw the Webber one. You think, well, at this point, the cars are basically impenetrable. Like,
but the only thing I'll say, when it comes to accidents, obviously you have Webber. Webber's stuff is spectacular, but the accidents I always am wary of are the ones where it's not spectacular. Because if you have a spectacular accident, like for example, Kubica in Canada, all of the energy is being dissipated, all the debris is going everywhere because that's what it's meant to do. It's when you see one massive hit is usually when you see someone have something bad. It's like when Dale Earnhardt died in NASCAR. That crash looks so innocuous. It looks like it's just another crash that happens, and a driver dies because it hits at a certain angle and because it throws him around and gives him a basilar skull fracture. It just happens when there's no kind of dramatics or no kind of crumple zones, no massive debris coming off because there's no energy being dissipated. It's all going through the driver.
I mean, like Felipe
94 because he had. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, like Felipe Massa was just a massive crash merchant, but he had one of his smaller crashes from a sort of theatrics perspective was Hungary 2009, getting hit on the head by a tiny bit of suspension. And yeah, that what knocked him out goes. I mean, he didn't really. The injury was from that because he then went into the barriers at full speed, and that didn't really do much because we had the Tech Pro. But that put him out of action for the rest of the season, and then he was clearly never the same after that as well, like compared to what he'd been doing in 2008 and everything.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, the Massa one, because you look at the footage, and I mean the closing speed of that spring must have been close to 200 miles an hour. He was incredibly lucky not to be killed. Let's be honest. I mean, you look at the photos of the helmet, and I think he still has the helmet, and there's still blood on it. How he just didn't get killed by that spring, because I think the spring alone weighed about 14 kilograms.
It was like 800 grams rather than that. If it was 14 kilograms, he'd be dead.
Oh yeah, because it came off.
I was confused with the Tom Price accident again.
Because it came off Barrichello's car, who was just in front of him. So I feel like it would have, it would have slowed down, but probably not enormously. I don't know, because it's coming off of a moving car.
Yeah, I think it's sort of just. It doesn't, from the footage you see, it doesn't look like it bounced or anything. It just sort of flew off and went down. But I think it actually came off at the bottom of that straight, or in this case, the top, where you sort of run down and then go up again. I think it came off there and just, I don't know, glided along. I'm not too sure, but yeah, it just. How unlucky can you get? You have that much of a wide track and this small spring, and it hits you there. But you did have, I think it was a week before, the week after, you had Henry Surtees killed at Brands Hatch in Formula 2 by a flying tyre. And those two incidents started the discussion of a cockpit safety device.
Yeah, the first one that came up was the aero screen, and that got tested a few times, which is what IndyCar uses. And I think it was 2016, Vettel tested this at Silverstone in FP1 at the British Grand Prix, and he came in after 2 laps because I can't do this. It's making me feel sick. It's giving me motion sickness. So then they quickly abandoned that. But then you think, well, IndyCar uses it and that's not a problem. So maybe it just needed a bit of refinement so it doesn't do that to them.
Because of the shape of it, it was distorting what drivers could see because like it was curved and all that sort of, like the Indy one, it was curved, but it's not curved in several ways. And they hadn't come up with an air thing because the reason why I was feeling nauseous is because you don't get air when you've got a screen in front of you. So the IndyCar goes on a pipe and it pumps air.
Oh, is that why they have that? Okay.
Yeah. They pump air into their helmets.
Right. Otherwise, you could, I suppose, I say you just drill a few small holes in the aero screen, but that probably creates some aerodynamic issues of its own or something. They come up with this, and then we had Gilles Bianchi 2014. This one, I mean, I've gotten so much stick up in the past for this, for sort of actually misrepresenting what actually happened in that crash, because it wasn't caught on camera by the official camera. Someone filmed it from a grandstand, but you can't really. You have that one piece of footage, and it happened so quickly it's hard to tell what happened. I thought what had happened was that he basically his helmet hit the rear end of that crane, and that was what did the damage. But it was actually just the stopping force, because you're going about 75 miles an hour and stopped basically instantly because the roll hoop got trapped under the truck.
Yeah,
and that was what did it, rather than like a direct impact to the head.
Yeah, because at first I thought it was a direct impact to the head, but then reading further in, found out he actually hit the roll hoop, and that just suddenly stopped the uh, stopped the car. The actual injury was forgotten what it was, but it was the same injury.
Diffuse axonal injury, basically when the brain moves around inside the skull.
That's the one. And Richard Hammond had the same one when he had the vampire dragster crash in that Top Gear episode. And yeah, that whole day again was just one of those cases of everything going wrong, and it could have easily been avoided because there were discussions about moving the race start time to earlier to avoid an incoming typhoon. They knew there was a typhoon on the way, so they knew a lot of rain was coming. They knew it was going to be very wet and potentially quite dangerous, and they decided not to because they didn't want to interrupt the TV schedules. But interestingly, looking at that footage of the Bianchi accident taken from that fan, you do see a camera, an official cameraman on a plinth recording, and he does record the entire thing. But that footage has never been released, and of course we don't see any onboard footage. But a lot of people also note that there's a green flag in shot, but that green flag is basically telling drivers that it's green from beyond to this point. A lot of people don't realize that it's not green before the flag, it's green after the flag, like a traffic light. And yeah, I think it was Adrian Sutil that went off before. And yeah, a lot of people seem to make up all sorts of theories as to what happened. A lot of people have downright blamed Bianchi for causing his own death. I've had some really horrible comments aimed at him for basically, it's your fault, ha kind of stuff, which I really just cannot stand. Because it doesn't matter if it's their fault or whatever. You should never, have that attitude towards a driver. And I've had people, to say some horrendous things about Bianchi, but at the same time, we must respect the fact that he was killed in a Formula One race, which should never have happened. And yeah, it's a peculiar one. It's because obviously he did die at the track. He died nearly a year later. And yeah, so it's a real big shame.
Another point that people don't often mention is that there were rumours that the Marussia throttle system had failed. Because when obviously they have the black box kind of like an airplane accident after they look back at the back at the traces of the throttle and the brakes. Apparently, he had pressed both the throttle and the brake at the same time when he was trying to decelerate and avoid hitting anything. But the Marussia had a system in place that if this happened, they would apply the brakes and not the throttle, and not both of them, so that it would slow down accordingly. But apparently that system had failed, and it pressed both the brake and the throttle at the same time, which could have, like, if we look at the what ifs, had that system not failed, he could have maybe that brake, because obviously aquaplaning, massive rain, he could have slowed that car down enough that he wouldn't have hit that tractor or hit whatever it was that caused him to die as heavily as it did.
It's a fail-safe mechanism. I think the idea was that it would cut the engine out. It's a bit of a funny one because there's always going to be a bit of overlap between throttle and brake application when you're driving. So it must be, well, if both of them go on heavy together. But the telemetry that we do have, it does seem to suggest that basically there were double wave yellows and he did not slow down, which is part of the reason he went off. And so that's one of the kind of the accusations that gets thrown. But again, this in one sense it showed the safety advancements that he died 9 months later and not like at the scene as well. Even though but once he was in hospital and comatose, everyone was thinking, okay, well if he does wake up, he's not going to race in Formula One again, and probably become a similar situation to what we've got with Michael Schumacher right now. But also the thing is that, again, this kind of dispels the idea that there was a direct impact to the head. Was that Marussia had a similar case 2 years earlier with Maria de Viotta, just doing a basic straight line test at an airfield, and she hit the loading bay of a lorry at about 30 miles an hour, and that almost killed her. She had to have she lost an eye and had to have an absolute avalanche of surgeries because her skull had basically been like broken open. But then she herself then did die over a year later from a heart attack, which is believed to have been caused by, even though she had seemingly made a full recovery. And that death happened during the Japanese Grand Prix weekend, one year before this Japanese Grand Prix race.
It is again, the whole weekend having the typhoon and everything, they could have easily just called it, and I think everyone would have understood.
Hmm.
And you saw with the podium celebrations, there were no real celebrations, so people can see that something serious had gone on. And this was a whole new generation of F1 fans watching this. It's been 20 years since the last bit of death during a race weekend. But once again, things have kind of got complacent by this point. Oh, no one can ever be killed in a Formula One race. That kind of attitude was still prevalent. And then that happens. And that goes back to my point that people have always got to be on top of things because stuff like this can happen still. I mean, I started watching rally a couple of years ago, and I started enjoying it. And my favourite driver was Craig Breen, and then he dies, and I haven't watched it since. And again, you've seen close calls even at Japan because I think again 1994, Martin Brundle went off at Dunlop and hit a Marshall, which broke his leg. And I think during broadcast, he had worried that someone had gone off and hit the truck, even before it was known that that's what had happened. And then in 2022, Pierre Gasly nearly hits the truck as well in conditions that they shouldn't have been racing in, let's be honest. And so, yeah, Suzuka's had some interesting incidents in the past. You've had Alan McNish go off at 130R where he went, again, over the barrier. And in GT racing and a host of other categories where accidents and pretty serious accidents had happened. And Suzuka again, really interesting. But Fuji's had its own incidents. So yeah, it's interesting to note that with Dunlop Corner and with trucks, that Suzuka's kind of always popped up in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, the Gasly incident, he was furious after that, but then it was a safety car and he was driving at full race speed still because he hadn't caught the safety car yet. And it's like, well, okay, that's kind of on you as well that you hadn't slowed down when it's just kind of little things like that. But yeah, Suzuka, it has that element of danger because it's characterized by the fact that there are almost no hard braking zones other than that hairpin. Other than that, you hardly ever touch the brakes. And we saw this only a few weeks ago with that Jack Doohan crash when the DRS failed, which actually wasn't it failing, it was just him messing up basically his the way he was using it. He had a fairly big shunt there. So yeah, they brought in the halo after this, but the thing about it is that they kind of said it wasn't really affected by Bianchi's crash because he hadn't suffered any direct head injuries, and if the halo had existed, he still would have the crash. It wouldn't have changed how that crash happened.
Yeah.
But when they brought it, it was controversial because a lot of drivers thought it wasn't necessary. They didn't like the way it looked. I imagine some of them were concerned about getting in and out of the car as easily. But then it seemed to me, I think some people have a tendency to maybe over-exaggerate where it's necessary because there have been... It's funny that we had a 20-year period of no deaths, and then since 2018, there have probably been at least 10 accidents where people claim, without the halo, they'd have died. But it's like, no, I really don't think we would have seen 10 fatal accidents in the past 8 years. Like the one that they bring up, Spa 2018 with Alonso and Leclerc, probably some of Mick's because he just was obsessed with crashing all the time. Like there's stuff like that, and you and I'm like, I really don't think these would have been fatal accidents. Like it's not. It comes across as like pro Halo propaganda, if you will. I don't know how to talk about it. But then we got Grosjean in 2020, and it's like, okay, now we see why we have it. Even though at the same time, it itself almost killed him because, okay, it protected him from the barriers and from having his head taken off. But then because of the way the car landed, it made it much harder for him to actually get out of the car. So it was like a double-edged sword, and he did just about get out, but it was like that he almost got trapped in because of the halo at the end of the day.
I mean, I for one, I do actually like the look of the halo. I don't mind it. So obviously people have said, oh, it doesn't look great, but I mean, you just get used to it, and most of the time you barely notice it's there. I mean, even in Sim, I hardly notice it's there, particularly when I'm in VR. But yeah, it goes back to the thing that Peter mentioned that all of a sudden we've had all these near fatal accidents. And it is strange that, again, Halo seems to be the thing that protects the driver and that's it. There's nothing else going on. But there has been accidents where you look at Grosjean, absolutely 100% yes. But also Hamilton and Verstappen in Monza 2021, where it looked like Verstappen's wheel was prevented from hitting, and basically crushing Hamilton's head in that accident because of the halo. See, I've got to be careful what I say here because we're going into the DTS DTS period. But another one is Guan Yu Zhou, Silverstone, which again a lot of people still talk about. Which we have seen similar accidents in the past. So I'm one of those controversial opinions that even without the halo, probably wouldn't have saved him, even if it wasn't there. I mean, he wasn't saved because he was fine anyway. But I think even without the halo, he would have been okay because we've had accidents like that before. I think in 1999, the Nürburgring.
Okay, so with that one, you'll think Pedro Diniz Nürburgring. He went okay. That one's a bit different because he went he went into wet grass like with Andre de Cesaris at Austria in 1985. But no, I think with Joe, I think he could well have died because the thing is the roll hoop was destroyed because he hit concrete or tarmac, and so he landed on tarmac. And without the halo, his head would have gone straight into that, and then it would have been. You've seen there's pictures of it, and the sparks coming off the halo as he's going across the track. His head basically would have been dragged along the track, and then along the the gravel trap. So I feel like that would have, if nothing else, it would have broken his neck. An impact like that. So that's where the halo. I mean, that was a concern. I wonder if this is being looked into. Is that maybe we need to find a way of strengthening the roll hoops because in that case the halo became the roll hoop in that crash.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Because I mean, at first it didn't show the replays for a long time when watching that. So immediately we were all like, "What's going on?" when that happens, you don't often, something bad has happened, but miraculously, thankfully, Guan Yu Zhou was able to come out of that. But even in IndyCar, we've seen accidents like that. I think at the Indy 500, 2023, we had an accident like that where again scraped along.
Paul Kirkwood,
Yes.
Paul Kirkwood, yes.
Yeah. And again, very close to his head being on the track. Can't remember. Well, Mass again in 1982 was another one of that that kind of severity. But we haven't really had any real severe accidents like that for the last couple of years, which begs the question: when will it happen again? I mean, it can happen at any time, and that's the thing we've always got to be careful of. I mean, we had that really strange incident at Baku where Ocon came into the pits and there was people there, which was just really strange, and all having to get out the way, Group B rally style.
Yeah,
it was really, really strange. We've had little moments like that where it could have been a lot worse.
But generally, it's not. You don't see. I mean, the only times we've had injuries was like things like when Daniel Ricciardo broke his wrists at Zandvoort, but that was just him being stupid enough to not take his hands off the steering wheel before crashing. Because there's a reason. Sometimes they get away, but a lot of time you will see them going into all. They take their hands off because otherwise they could break their wrists. And that it's just little things like that. I feel like something has to happen. Something will happen eventually. But for the time being, there's so much at play, and also because something we didn't mention was the introduction of in-car radios in the mid-1980s. That just communication is there because you can tell drivers immediately, okay, there's a safety car, or slow down here. There's been a big crash at this corner, or something of that nature. And that alone could have made if they'd had that technology from the 50s onwards, that alone could have made an enormous difference in a lot of cases. But now, there's not the Hubert accident because that had nothing to do with that had nothing to do with the halo because that was just a side-on impact at full speed, and they haven't. When they did their official report on it, they were very vague. They didn't give specifics about the nature of his injuries or anything, and it's kind of hard to tell from the footage. But it looks like you can see his entire side profile as if like the side pod has been ripped out of the car. It's really hard to tell if it was more that he was hit directly or if it's just the force of the impact was enough to just do the injuries or whatever. And then and you think, is that something that can be prevented by making the side pod stronger, or is that just an unfortunate kind of coincidence and wrong place at the wrong time?
I think that with Hubert, It was more so the fact that he'd had one impact with the side pod, I think, or that with the car in general. And then he had a second impact, and the cars aren't designed to have second impacts; they're designed to take it all in one go.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the solution is to just put gravel at the top of a roof so cars can't bounce back onto the circuit. At the end of the day.
I mean, yeah, Lando had a pretty sizable crash in 2021 in qualifying at that. I mean, Eau Rouge is a bit of a thorn in the side because but this is another issue that we've had, is this obsession with runoff everywhere. Because if you're going to do runoff, do what they've done at Paul Ricard without the, psychedelic seizure-inducing stripes. The stuff that is highly abrasive and slows the car down, like, you need that, because otherwise you're getting cars, and again, this creates the unending problems we have with track limits. Because the whole thing is just built in a car park, and it's like, normally the track limits are, well, if you go off, it because you've caught grass or gravel and the car spins or slows down, rather than, oh, you're 2 millimeters over this white line, so we have to invalidate your entire lap, when it's made probably no measurable difference to your lap time or whatever. It's just little things like that need to be dealt with, and they fortunately have started getting rid of sausage curbs, because that partly caused that collision with Max and Hamilton, but also Alex Peroni in Formula 3 getting sent airborne by a sausage curb on the exit of Parabolica and then breaking his back because he basically the catch fencing did his job. He was caught in the catch fencing, but just like hanging from it like a tree or whatever. It's little things now, but I feel like there may eventually be a fatality, but it's hard to say in what circumstances it could happen, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite, in today's modern audience, kind of saying that comes with a bit of well, I guess it would be controversial to say that, but again, you have to say that to be sensible, because this is still a very dangerous sport, and not just Formula One, but IndyCar, WEC, Rally. We've seen rally fatalities in the last couple of years, and particularly Air Rouge and Rally on. I think that's still kind of like the last remnant of a bygone age kind of thing.
Yeah.
You kind of seen, I think a couple of years ago, you had the Cadillac who went off there and smashed into a million tiny pieces, which broke my heart. But
Delano Van at Hoff in Freca as well. It's a very similar crash to Antoine Hubert.
Yeah, and you see
Same
the
thing.
W Series as well. And even still, I think last weekend you saw a pretty bad accident at Air Rouge as well. But I, for one, wouldn't want to see it disappear. But I feel like there is things that they can do, like a runoff or just double layer of barriers or something. I just want them to just not take it away, because again, people relish the opportunity to go up Air Rouge and Radion. People want to do it, and that's the key thing when it comes to motor racing. People want to do it, and we shouldn't take it away. Another thing, it's not F1, but the Isle of Man TT. You hear it every year, oh, it should be banned and everything. But as long as it's not hurting spectators, we shouldn't take it away, because riders want to take on the Isle of Man TT. I mean, I personally wouldn't, but it's their people want to do it. We shouldn't take it away. And the same thing with Air Rouge, shouldn't be taken away.
They understand the risks, and I don't know if this is the case, if the drivers or in instances are expected to sign some kind of waiver that's like, I may die or whatever, and that's just something of that nature. I don't know.
That's the thing. On the back of every ticket, it says, motorsport is dangerous. I mean, I've got my Goodwood ticket here, and it says that quite clearly on the back of it. And you see it everywhere, and that's the thing you've got to realise, even as a spectator, you probably could potentially see something bad happen. Even at air shows, you go to an air show, something bad could happen.
I mean, I'm going to Goodwood this year, and I'm not going to lie, it does kind of concern me that they're still using hay bales, because it's all fine and well that they're not driving at full speed, but then you've got things like the McMurtry Spearling going up there. If that, you can't have that. And we had last year and the year before, but there was that Leighton House got wrecked, and a few other cars, and it's like, I don't know, that rubs me the wrong way. Having hay bales.
You can't see hay bales flying at Goodwood. I mean, obviously I go there every year, and I do see these accidents, and you are quite close to the track. I think last year they made them slightly bigger, which made viewing a bit awkward. But it is still a little bit strange to me how hay bales are still used there. Because again, the McMurtry Spearling is ridiculously quick. If that goes wrong, I dread to think what could happen, because it has happened at the Goodwood Festival of Speed where fatalities have occurred. So but I don't think you need to worry, Peter.
Yeah.
It'll be fine.
Mm.
But Yeah, it's weird how historical events are kind of allowed to still be historical. You had Monaco last year, the historic race there. You had cars that collided on the start-finish line, but there wasn't a red flag. It was kind of a weird situation, and even the commentators were sort of talking amongst themselves, being like, what's going on? Why isn't there a red flag or a safety car? But there's two cars that are in bits on the start-finish line, and the race is still going on. So you have these little lapses, and again, we don't want to see it, but we kind of got to be prepared for when it does happen.
Yeah, I think it's more likely with those because they use the same cars, but they have modern helmets at least. But I think with modern F1, we're at a point where there's little more that can be done. I think that doesn't just impinge upon the quality of the racing at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean that was a good roundhouse. I think of how safety is advanced, and it's good to reflect on. It's just so much has changed, the technology, but also the attitudes and everything. But yeah, I think we can just consider ourselves fortunate that we live in the era we do, and we can enjoy it in relative safety, and the drivers can race also in relative safety.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. We're on YouTube and Spotify, and you can find us on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Make sure to tune in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.
Bye.
Bye.